As introduced, I'm Andy Batty, Director of Operations at Deliveroo. So before I kind of get into talking about the actual content of today, I thought it'd be super helpful to give a little bit of insight as to the kind of size and scale of Deliveroo. Some of the stats you just heard there were kind of UK stats, but actually we're a business that operates in 10 different markets throughout Europe, Middle East, and Asia. And it's a pretty scalable business, 150,000 riders who log into the platform each and every week and month. And we conduct about 5.5 million orders globally every single week. And you might think actually that food delivery is relatively simple. I mean, Domino's have been delivering pizza in the UK pretty effectively for about the last 40 years. But Domino's actually offer up a solution which is largely a hub and spoke solution. So you essentially have delivery drivers who are associated with a particular individual restaurant, and they service an area around that restaurant. And actually, that does pretty well. They've got over 1,000 sites live in the UK at the moment. But actually, what we chose to do is something quite different. And our operating model is just much more challenging. We essentially look to seamlessly link available riders who are all self-employed with restaurants that are able to offer, for the most extent, actually dine-in with riders who are available. And these riders are totally fluid. Because they're self-employed, they can log in or log out whenever they want, and they can accept jobs from any restaurant or equally choose to reject any job that we send them. It's totally fluid. And we have this really smart system called Frank, which essentially has to do the job of understanding how to allocate the next best orders to the next best rider. What's really smart about it is actually that Frank is able to seamlessly consider the best rider for the next customer. And that's not just the next customer who's placed an order. It also considers customers that are actually building their basket live. And it's that clever that it can actually also understand exactly when it should offer a single rider 2 orders from the same restaurant, or equally 2 orders from different restaurants to 2 different customers. It's all pretty smart stuff. What's really interesting about our model as well is that because riders are self-employed, they can actually operate across multiple apps at once. And about 2/3 of the UK fleet operate across at least 2 delivery platforms, which makes all of my job that a little bit more difficult. So this is essentially just a depiction of what a kind of typical evening in London looks like, with the dots showing a combination of restaurants, riders, and customers. And the thing's really interesting about this is that it's highly dynamic and highly fluid. And the reason for this is because actually riders are they're capable of essentially operating in any part of the city. They travel around the city as they pick up and drop off. And because they're not locked into one particular restaurant, they literally traverse the city throughout the whole of the period. And the interesting thing about the way that we operate is that it's actually an incredibly kind of dynamic business. So the lunch period is much bigger than breakfast, and dinner is much bigger than lunch. And it's probably no surprise to most of you that our busiest time is Friday, 7 p.m., payday weekend. And at this point in time, you can probably imagine we're doing quite a lot of orders. So what's happening live? So actually, Frank, our dispatching algorithm, is essentially looking at orders coming in, restaurants available, and riders. And it's looking to seamlessly make those perfect allocations. And just a couple of really interesting stats for you. So our dispatching algorithm plans over 1 trillion unique routes every single day. 1 trillion. And that's a system that's using 20 terabytes of data every single hour, spanning or scanning data warehouses that contain 4 petabytes. That's 4 petabytes of data. This is big data. And what's really interesting is that actually as part of Frank's consideration, so as part of making sure we get the perfect delivery to the customer who's placed an order, we also have to think about the type of vehicle that we're going to dispatch to. Said differently, there is no point in sending a bicycle to an order which is 5-7 miles away. It's just not going to be a good customer outcome. But it's not just the vehicle type that Frank is considering. It's also traffic conditions, network load, and frankly, anything else that's going on, including how we cope with the likes of New Year's Eve fireworks in central London and any other events like London Marathon, these kind of things. So let me just talk about the challenge of moving towards kind of zero-emission capable deliveries. So the challenge for us is twofold. First of all, we're kind of looking at our Scope 3 emissions. And our Scope 3 emissions are about 10x the combination of our Scope 1 and Scope 2. And what's really interesting about that is about half of our Scope 3 emissions are actually within delivery. So many tech companies are worried about infrastructure and kind of server costs and server emissions, but actually for us, it's all about logistics. And because our riders are self-employed, it's all about steering and trying to encourage riders. We actually don't have the ability to essentially specify what vehicle type they operate on. And so when I think about really what's the opportunity for us is both about sustainability and logistical efficiency. And we get upsides from both, frankly. So when choosing a vehicle to ride on, essentially riders really want the best cost and efficiency trade-off. They're looking for things that are both quick and efficient, and what we try to do is encourage them to go green as well. Interestingly, a couple of stats for you. So we ran an exercise and a trial by which we looked at the efficiency gains and the improvements we could see from riders when we converted riders who used bicycles and moved them to e-bikes. And what we found was that riders could do 67% more orders on an e-bike in a particular shift than they could on a bicycle. That's because they're quicker, but they could also work for longer during the shift without getting tired. But interestingly for us, and this is where the benefit for Deliveroo comes, we saw a 25% reduction in poor customer outcomes. So this really is a win-win. I just want to share with you kind of a bit of data on our actual transition towards an EV fleet. So you can see the transition of electrical vehicle deliveries from Q4 20 through to Q3 2020. You can see it's pretty much doubled in terms of the amount of deliveries done by electric vehicles. And although obviously some of this transition is from bicycles to e-bikes, which obviously helps us from a logistics point of view and an operational efficiency point of view, but clearly doesn't help from a sustainability point of view, we do see an increasing trend in terms of riders moving away from fossil fuel vehicles, in particular mopeds, into electric bikes, in particular in the city. And what's interesting actually about the way that we operate, of course, most of the orders that we fulfill are in cities, and the density that you get from cities means that we actually have relatively short orders, and that means that EVs, and in particular e-bikes, are the perfect solution for delivering those orders. And London is actually one of the densest cities that we operate in, and therefore actually is quite a long way ahead of most of the places when it comes to the transition to electric vehicles and zero-emission deliveries. But we're not the only ones seeing this trend. For example, we know that in Europe about 5.5 million bikes are sold every year. And we believe that could actually be e-bikes are sold every year. And we are confident that's likely to double in the next 5 to 7 years. And although there have been lots of examples in the relatively recent past of micromobility companies failing, only a couple of weeks ago, there's a electric bike rental company in France that took a 30 million Series B funding round. So again, although although there are challenges in some of these businesses and some of these business models, there are success stories, or certainly the first signs of them. So how as Deliveroo can we help riders to make the switch to electric vehicles? Just behind me is essentially our commitment across a number of different markets in terms of how we're supporting riders. And what you can see is that we're supporting riders to not only purchase electric vehicles, and in particular electric bikes, but also how we look to give them access through rentals or leasing. And we actually see a really good uptick because, interestingly, the biggest barrier to transferring from a bicycle to an e-bike, or even actually a scooter to an e-bike, is actually cost. Again, just staying on case studies for a second. So we actually ran a heavily subsidized trial with riders who essentially got the offer of a 50% off Zumo e-bike in order to encourage them and allow them to essentially reduce the barriers to moving particular vehicle types. And what we saw was that although 50% actually said they wouldn't transition and wouldn't switch long-term because it's too expensive, the stats lower down on the left-hand side are actually really quite telling. Just some quick maths would suggest that about 40% of riders actually showed a real intent either to go and change vehicle to an electric vehicle, or actually that they would at least consider and thought that it provided an upside for them. And most interestingly as well is that the riders obviously appreciated that they could earn more money and deliver more orders if they're on a faster vehicle type. And this is exactly what we see in our data too. So what help do we need to further drive this adoption and transition? So firstly, we need help with infrastructure, and really we need the government to help with allowing riders to understand that this is the way forward, and we need a greater acceptance of the positive roles that electric vehicles, and in particular e-bikes, can play. Secondly, with cost being the biggest barrier, we really need to look at how we de-risk the financial investment for riders. And finally, as Deliveroo, we take responsibility for making sure that if you have an electric vehicle, certainly over a fossil fuel vehicle, we make it worth your while. So we're constantly looking at how we evolve the way that our dispatching works to make sure that that riders who do make the transition are kind of rewarded for it, let's say. However, the logistics element of what we do is actually only a really tiny proportion of the overall emissions that are related to the deliveries that we make or the orders that we fulfill. The vast, vast majority are actually in the wider food production and food system. So clearly, this is going to be much smaller for a vegan meal rather than a beef burger, but you kind of get the point. So let me finally finish on the road ahead. Of course, we continue to want to move and incentivize our riders towards zero-emission capable deliveries. But actually, that's not where we start and finished. I've got colleagues who are looking at a whole spectrum of different ways to make the industry more sustainable and reduce the amount of carbon emitted. On packaging, we've launched a £2.5 million investment in packaging subsidies to allow restaurant partners to move towards eco-friendly packaging. And we even have a packaging store which is fulfilled by Deliveroo to aid that transition. Secondly, we know that about a third of food that's made by our restaurant partners is actually wasted. So what we've done is within the restaurant hub, which is where our restaurants interact with us, we've actually put a training module in there to help restaurants measure and ultimately reduce food waste. And finally, at Deliveroo, we do some kind of cooking and facilitation of meal preparation ourselves in our dark kitchens, which we call additions. And what we're doing there is looking to procure renewable and sustainable energy systems and also do the likes of recycling cooking oils, all in order to reduce our emissions and our carbon footprint. That's the future of Deliveroo. Thank you for listening.